All right, hello, and welcome back to the Broken Business Models podcast. We're your hosts, Ryan and James. And before we get into today's podcast, just a quick disclaimer nothing in this podcast or any of our other material should be taken as investing advice. James or I could have positions in any stock that we mention, and we reserve the right to change those positions with or without notice at any time. So make sure you do your own work and always consult with a professional before making any investment decision. With that being said, the topic of today's video is going to be IonQ. Now, we've made videos on IonQ quite some time ago, but the company has recently released some significant updates that warrant reevaluating our position on the company. So for those who are newer to the channel, just a quick background. IonQ is in the business of quantum computing. So their business model is to develop their own technology in quantum computing, which they do have a small quantum computer of their own at this time, and basically develop the technology to the point where they can sell use of their quantum computer to companies to use for real world applications, high performance computing and things like that. The problem is that quantum computers, unlike regular computers, are random, so they make mistakes, and because of that, researchers are generally agree that for any practical use, quantum computers would need on the order of at least millions of these qubit units, compute units, to overcome this randomness. Currently, the best quantum computers today only have about 1,000 qubits, so they would need about 1,000 times more than the currently most powerful quantum computer. Because of this challenge, current work in quantum computing is always experimental, not practical. And I just have an example headline from Nature magazine from last year showing that for now, quantum computers are good for absolutely nothing. But as they have been for the past several decades, researchers and firms are optimistic about the future applications of quantum computing. IonQ has announced several research deals with various research institutions over the past several years that has resulted in revenue. However, these research deals are all experimental and mostly sound better than they actually are. So, for example, Amazon Web Services, AWS doesn't actually use quantum computing itself. It simply offers quantum computing to its own clients using companies like IonQ and others. IonQ has also announced research partnerships with various Fortune 500 companies, such as GE Research. However, these are mostly very small scale partnerships that result in small amounts of revenue for IonQ, and these are for companies to basically tinker around with quantum computing and basically explore this technology for themselves without actually using it for anything practical. They also have a lot of revenue in partnerships with the University of Maryland. However, the University of Maryland is a related party, with one of IonQ's founders being a faculty member at the University of Maryland, and related party transactions are always a concern. And finally, a very large portion of their revenue comes from the US military, which we'll get into later on in the video. Throughout its history, IonQ has been highly promotional. Even going back as far as 2019, we found evidence of them talking about how their quantum computers will be used by leading companies in all sorts of fields. However, none of these investigations have ever come to anything real and practical. And we also have many examples of highly promotional articles coming out in publications, such as even from Forbes, talking about how IonQ is creating a revolution in quantum computing. And this has led to extreme volatility in IonQ's stock price, including many huge increases in stock value, including one instance recently. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to you, James, to talk about the company's deals with the U.S. military and especially their recent announcements.
Yeah, thank you. So before we get into that, just a really quick reminder about our website, differentiatedanalytics.com. So if you don't already know, we have this website where we provide a whole host of tools for retail investors. most importantly is our original short selling research, which we find companies which we view as either overvalued or fraudulent. And we find our best ideas and write detailed professional grade short reports explaining our bear thesis on these stocks. So if that at all sounds interesting to you, make sure to check out differentiatedanalytics.com. The link is in the description below. And now back to IonQ. So, as Ryan alluded to earlier, there has been a big recent development with IonQ, where last week on September 27th, they announced that they received a $54 million contract with the United States Air Force, and that is the biggest contract that they had ever received in the past. So this is a big deal for them. And as a result of this news, the share price increased by about 20%. So investors were clearly very excited about this. Now, it's important to dig a little bit deeper and see what exactly does this mean for the company going forward. So, also, as Ryan alluded to earlier, the US government is IonQ's most important customer. And the reason is back a few years ago, the Congress allocated funding for the National Quantum Initiative. So, they allocated a few $1 billion of funding that the US government agencies, including the military and others, have to use to investigate and do research in quantum computing. So as a result, because they have all this funding, the U.S. Department of Defense has given large contracts to various quantum computing companies, including IonQ and others, to conduct basically quantum research. Now, IonQ has clearly been a big beneficiary of this. Last year, they received a $25 million deal with the Air Force. And then, now this year, they've received an even bigger $54 million deal also with the Air Force. So IonQ has clearly been a big beneficiary of this government money. Now, the thing is with these government programs, this quantum research has not yet resulted in any practical applications that can actually be used. But the government has money allocated to conduct research on this. Now, that does not necessarily validate that quantum computing is actually going to be legit and going to have real world applications in the future. The government funds research projects all the time that often end up being a flop and resulting in nothing. So just the fact that they're receiving a bunch of revenue from the government, when this is just because Congress has allocated funds that have to be spent on quantum research, that by itself is not a vindication that their quantum computer can actually do anything useful. And as we will discuss later, we have other reasons to believe that the quantum computer cannot do anything useful. And so I think it's very important with IonQ to understand exactly where their revenue is coming from. So a significant customer is defined as a customer that represents at least 10% of the company's total revenue. And IonQ disclosed that for 2023, they had two significant customers that accounted for 58% of total revenue. Now, they do not disclose who these customers are, but we can make some pretty good guesses as to who they are. Now, we know for sure one of these significant customers is the University of Maryland. And we know this because the University of Maryland is a related party to IonQ because one of the co-founders of IonQ is also a professor at the University of Maryland. And the University of Maryland and IonQ have a very complicated financial and intellectual property agreements, and they have a very complicated relationship with each other, which we've delved into in our previous videos that you can check out. But the point is, University of Maryland is a related party of IonQ, and companies are required to disclose how much revenue they generate from related parties. So we know that in 2023, they generated $4.6 million from the University of Maryland, which makes University of Maryland one of the significant customers. Now, the other significant customer is almost certainly the U.S. Air Force because they signed, or I don't know how what they would call it. Would they call like the U.S. Air Force one customer, or maybe the Department of Defense is one customer? So whether it's the U.S. government is definitely the biggest customer. because they've signed, massive deals with the Air Force. So I strongly believe that the two significant customers are the US government and the University of Maryland. So now let's look at the first half of 2024. So in the first half of 2024, they had two significant customers, which accounted for 75% of total revenue. So their customer concentration is becoming even more concentrated. And I believe that the two largest customers are still the same, the U.S. government and University of Maryland. So now, the U.S. government and University of Maryland make up 75% of IonQ's revenue in the first half of 2024, which is a very extreme level of customer concentration. So now that we have established those two significant customers, what does this mean as far as where IonQ is actually getting its revenue from? So we know that in 2023, they had $22 million of total revenue. 58% came from the two significant customers, of which the University of Maryland contributed $4.6 million, and the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, contributed $8 million, because if you take the 8 million plus 4.6 million, that adds up to the 58%. So that means that all other customers combined contributed $9 million to IonQ's revenue. So now let's look at the first half of 2024. So in the first half of 2024, they generated $19 million. So this is a massive increase compared to the prior year, because in the entire year of 2023, they only generated $22 million. Now in the first half of 2024, they've already generated, almost that amount of money. So the revenue is increasing very quickly, and that's one of the reasons why investors have gotten so excited about the stock. However, we have to disaggregate this, because now 75% of that 19 million comes from the US government and University of Maryland. So that's $14 million comes from the US government and University of Maryland. So if we subtract that, that means that only $5 million in the first half of 2024, IonQ only generated $5 million of revenue from all other customers. And if we compare that to how much revenue they generated from other customers in 2023, it's about the same, only a very small increase. So the reason I'm going through all this in such detail is to show that their revenue has indeed been growing a lot in the first half of this year, but that's purely the result of increased revenue from the U.S. government and University of Maryland, not from commercial other customers. And this is not a vindication of IonQ's technology that it can actually be useful for anything. Because as I explained earlier, they're just getting revenue from the US government because Congress has allocated this funding. Whether quantum computing is viable or not, the money has already been allocated and it has to be spent. And then the University of Maryland is a related party. And whenever you have a related party transaction, you cannot view that as but you basically have to take related party revenue with a grain of salt, because there can be a lot of conflicts of interest and such. Now, if the IonQ quantum computer was really so great and so useful as the company claims, what about all the Fortune 500 companies like General Electric and many other of these big mega corporations that IonQ has done work with in the past and done some small scale experimentations with? Well, if the quantum computer was actually useful for anything practical, they would be generating more than $5 million from from other customers. Right? They'd be able to generate more revenue from their Fortune 500 customers, but they're not. So that makes me think that this quantum computer is really not useful. So they can only get the revenue growth from their related party university and the U.S. government. So now let's move on to this recent news from September 26th, when they announced this. They disclosed that they received this $54 million contract with the U.S. Air Force. Now, this $54 million is over the course of 4 years, so they'll be generating about $14 million of revenue per year. This is these contracts they have with the Air Force are to do some research. What I call them tinkering contracts, where their IonQ provides access to its quantum computer to the Air Force, and then IonQ will also lend a lot of their technical expertise to the Air Force, where the Air Force can do some research and experimentations and tinkering with the quantum computer to see if maybe it could one day eventually have some applications. But they're not actually using the quantum computer today for anything of practical use. And given the physics of how the quantum computer works, how Ryan explained earlier, it may not even ever be possible that the quantum computer can ever do anything useful. They're just doing research, which may or may not amount to anything. And thus far, I do not believe that any of IonQ's research has actually developed anything that can solve any real world problems or have any practical applications. And let's look at the financials. So in the first half of 2020, in the first half of 2024, they generated $19 million of revenue, which is indeed a big increase from the prior year. But their operating expenses have also exploded from $71 million up to $121 million. And one of the reasons their operating expenses are increasing so much is because as they are trying to get these contracts from the government and from the University of Maryland, well, they have to hire, it's not just giving them access to the quantum computer and that's that. They do joint research and development, and IonQ has to lend their technical expertise for these partnerships. So that obliges IonQ to hire a bunch of, very expensive PhDs, like physics PhDs, to basically fulfill these contracts they have, these research contracts that they have. So that's why their operating expenses have been exploding. And despite the fact that their revenue is increasing, their losses are also exploding. In the first half of 2024, they generated an operating loss of $100 million. And yet according to this new contract, they're going to be getting from the Air Force $14 million per year of additional revenue. Well, that's going to come with significant costs as well. But even that is pretty tiny compared to the $100 million that they lost, the $100 million operating loss just in the first half of this year. So the losses are very extreme, and the amount of revenue they're generating, while it has been increasing from a small base, it's pretty negligible. The revenue is pretty small compared to how much money they're losing. Yeah, and then we can see here, this is why investors, have gotten so excited about IonQ stock, is that as a percentage, if you look at the percentage gain of revenue, it has been very impressive. But that was starting from a very small base. And as we explained earlier, almost all of this revenue growth is just coming from the US government and University of Maryland, and is not indicative of the quantum computer actually being useful for anything in the real world. And even as the revenue has grown, their operating losses have also exploded. And if we look at the amount of cash that IonQ has on their balance sheets, so after they did the SPAC transaction, they raised a ton of money, and they had about $600 million of cash and equivalents and bonds and stuff. As they have incurred operating losses, their cash pile has been decreasing. And if you look at kind of the shape of these bars, you can see that the decline in cash is accelerating. So back here in 2022, they weren't, it was only decreasing a little bit each quarter, but now the amount of cash is decreasing much faster. And in the trailing 12-month period, they burned $118 million of negative free cash flow, and that rate of cash burn is accelerating. So at the current rate, they will probably run out of cash within the next 2 to 3 years, in which case they will most likely have to start doing dilutive equity raises. Now, just to sum up, the big picture of this is that while IonQ, if you look at the financials of IonQ and see that revenue is increasing a lot as a percentage, and they're announcing these big contracts with the government, that all looks good on paper. But for any quantum computing company to be viable in the long run, they need to have real commercial applications where big companies would actually pay them significant amounts of money to use their quantum computers to solve real world problems. Thus far, all we have with IonQ is tinkering and experimentation contracts that do not solve real world problems. And as that is, IonQ will never generate enough money or enough revenue to cover their massive operating expenses. All right, guys, so that wraps it up for today's video. As always, if you have any thoughts on IonQ, please let us know in the comment section below, and we will see you on next week's video.